Okay, yeah, welcome to the online participants. This is our next panel. We have around 35 to 40 minutes to learn a little bit more about science and research and training, professional training, and all of these issues involved in the big questions of critical raw materials extraction and how do we want to go from there. And we have really the great honor to have today geology people, mining engineering people, civil society, research, two research from social sciences. So, and what we would like to elaborate a bit on in this short session is how can we communicate together as different disciplines in an interdisciplinary manner? How can we join forces and the knowledge in the expertise field? But the next big question is, and we all are convinced, as I know, that we should speak with the broader public about these issues. We should do research with public stakeholders, societal stakeholders, who have the fundamental knowledge that we need to achieve a just energy transition and to deal with all these paradox situations around critical raw materials extraction. And I would like to ask Michael to introduce yourself, please, briefly, and your 5-minute statement.
Thanks, Gerti. I mentioned before that I would do the introductions and my 5 minutes via the introduction. So I'll get back into that, and I'll start again with my oxymoron, Professor for Sustainable Mining Technology. It does not exist yet, but I guess let me try through my story and the development on how I think I will contribute towards getting there. I started off as Sustainable Development Advisor for Rio Tinto after having finished my studies in Leoben. By trade, I'm an environmental engineer, so not a mining engineer, but I started for working in one of the larger mining companies. And I always felt when working in that area, in that space, that we were working in the right direction, but we were not going far enough, i.e. we were on a sort of river that was going towards a waterfall. We were rowing against the current, but still we were slowing down the current, but yet we were still going towards that waterfall. And I had no idea, that kind of was my feeling with sustainable development, that with that development I had no idea how to actually change that and how to stop that. And I left Rio and went to another one of those companies or organizations, the World Economic Forum, as head of mining and metals. And there in Davos I met Johan Rockström, who actually did the presentation on the planetary boundaries. And for me, that planetary boundaries description and how he described that kind of described the waterfall, in a sense that we have to stay within the planetary boundaries. And for me, it was something that kind of gave me really that focus or that description on where sustainability in that case, what it actually means or should mean, and where sustainable development in the contribution of mining towards that should actually be anchored in. So we then at the WEF dealt with mining and metals scenarios, and by the way, in the conversation today, a lot of what we looked at back 15 years ago almost, green trade alliance, the kind of green colonialism that I heard about today already, and whether or not it is colonialism or whether or not it can be partnerships was part of that conversation. Rebased globalism, how to actually bring justice into the extraction countries versus the consuming countries was one of the scenarios that we looked at there, but also resource security, that we have blocks in the world and these blocks look at securing the resources that they actually need. So all of what we see in the world today, we actually described in those scenarios. But then from there we moved for the first time in the WEF as well to describe sustainability in mining in sort of in absolute terms, using the planetary boundaries. We described that as mining in a sustainable world, and we put that as a North Star out there in 2050. And with that, I guess, I moved back, decided to look into this further, moved back to Austria, to Montanuniversität Leoben, where I got the opportunity to do a PhD, and I looked into, and that kind of went back into my experience with Rio Tinto. It is a commercial firm, so money matters. They are out there to make money. And I looked into the impact of monetarization. So what if mining companies had to pay for their, in this case, environmental impact? And what if they had to pay prices that were based on absolute boundaries? So if you were to look at CO2, for instance, European trading system prices at the moment somewhere in the range 80, 90, 100 euros, but science already looked into this as well. If we wanted to get towards 1.5 degrees, prices had to be somewhere in the range 300, 400 euros. So I applied 300, 400 euros to CO2 emissions from mining and looked at whether or not metal mining would still be profitable in that case. We don't need to go into those type of details, but just to explain on what I sort of focused on with regards to my research. And it still pays off to a very large extent, but some of the mines in the world would not pay off anymore. So that goes then back into sort of certain limitations, and we probably have to look into the uses of those scarce resources actually, and prioritize those uses as well. As part of me coming back, I also got involved into European Union projects. One of them was Mireu. That was the one that looked into massaging public acceptance. We tried to explain what social license to operate, what social acceptance actually means in the European context. And a key outcome of that was that there is a local component, which sort of was the beginning of social acceptance very much 20 years ago. But in Europe, there's also the societal component that is very important. And they are often contradictory. So that, for instance, you have lignite mining still being accepted locally in Eastern Germany or in Poland, but globally, due to climate change, it's not acceptable anymore. And the other way around, that lithium is accepted socially, societally, as kind of a part of the solution when it comes to climate change. But when you look at Spain or or Portugal, as it already was mentioned, it's not locally accepted. So we need to resolve that, was one of the things we looked into. And then I also got involved in the SUMEX project, Sustainable Management of Extractive Industries, where we tried to go back into what does sustainability for mining actually mean. And we had a multi-stakeholder process as part of that one, and came up again with a roadmap process that by 2050 this is how it needs to look like. And I think, contrary to what was said before, I agree that we at the moment maximum at responsible mining, but I think that we can and have to push that much, much further. So for instance, carbon neutral mining, and then the whole value chain to become carbon neutral. Just to mention one aspect or one topic that we described within that was an element that was part of that as well. So I leave it there, but of course I also recognize and realize what came up today, that what we are working on in Leoben as our chair of mining engineering and mineral economics, in order to get the mining process towards that sustainable mining. A lot of that will be underground mining, can't be cave mining anymore, as is the case in Corona at the moment, for instance, where they're moving the town because of the caving in. All those new methods to be used, that's what we are focusing on. And underground mining for sure will play a stronger role here in Europe, particularly where land is rather scarce already. that's our focus, but that's sort of the micro level of the mining process. The macro level already came in here as well, which is that larger, much larger debate about how much mining do we actually need, and for what do we need the minerals, the metals? Is it luxury products, luxury use, or do we really need them, for instance, for the energy transition? So I'll stop here. I do think sustainable mining exists, but we don't see it yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. I think that you illustrated well how research then really reaches out to other sectors, like policy advice, as you do with the roadmap, working with the industry, and also your work with the societal acceptance. This shows very well what we as researchers also should do, can do in terms of conversation and dialogue. And we have now with Holger Paulick, a representative of a public institution here, and I'm really curious, as you as a geologist, right, and see your role in a public institution. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Holger. I work at GeoSphere Austria, and part of that is the Geological Survey of Austria. My department is called Geoenergy and Mineral Resources, and we have a pretty specific mission, which is to investigate Austria in terms of useful mineral materials for the benefit of Austrian society and industry. That's been our mission straight on from being founded in 1858, I believe it was, by the old Habsburg Kaiser, and has had in those days already much to do with the idea of recognizing that natural mineral resources under your own control are probably the best way to secure the development of industry and livelihoods. We have been discussing different things today that I would like to use my minutes for to try to separate. I think one thing that we have been looking at was the global rising demand for mineral resources on a whole, and in that regard we have to make sure that we understand that the most uptake of mineral raw materials has been by developing countries, most notably and quite very much on the forefront of that, China. The last 20 years, China has been dominating the demand for mineral raw materials. And that was together with the development of China from a poor agricultural-based society to becoming the global leader of industrial domination, almost in some parts of the industries that there are today. Looking forward, some people believe that India might be the next area where this sort of development might take place, and that will mean that the global demand for basic raw materials will continue to increase. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that we as Europeans, or as maybe representatives of the global north, are not playing the decisive role in the demand for mineral raw materials, but it's the developing nations of the world. On the other hand, we've been discussing the Critical Raw Materials Act, and that is to do with recognizing that the rules of global access to all sorts of materials and goods and services that have been the development route for the last 20, 30 years has changed. You cannot take for granted that China will be happily supplying us with whatever semi-goods or raw materials that we need, and that countermeasurements must be taken just to be on the safe side. And that is to do with this benchmark of 10% mining in Europe for critical raw materials. And this is quite a strong challenge. but in terms of geological endowment of the European continent, I can assure you from the geological perspective, there's huge potential. And most decisively, when you looked at the map that Karen was just presenting a little while ago, those dots all over, this is just the information that we know of. A large part of the European continent is underexplored, and this has to do with the fact that the last 20 or 30 years mining exploration has been really going down in Europe because of global competition. And in terms of knowing what is underneath the immediate surface, let's say between like 10 or maybe 10 meters to 200 meters, which is completely feasible for mining, of course, we have very little knowledge. And this is to do with the matter that we are not lacking expertise, but we would need more expertise to actually apply the methodologies that are available today to understand the subsurface much better. So leading nations would be, of course, Australia and Canada in that respect, and we would need to be more aware that in order to fully understand the potential of commodity endowment, we would have to have more expertise in these arenas. And some parts of Europe are better positioned than others, and we hope to do our best when it comes to Austria.
Thank you, Holger, for this outlook and the challenges ahead. Ellen Marie Jensen is our next speaker, and Ellen is also part of the Beyond Hot Air team. And I know we very often talk about the fact that the Beyond Hot Air team is interdisciplinary, and we have Frank as the geologist on board and others. But you're a social scientist and have Sami background, and I think you can tell us a little bit more how you relate science and society.
Well, Frank was the first geologist I've had conversations with about these issues. But I think it's important to say I really do indigenous studies, and I would say that I'm kind of a Sami and indigenous studies generalist. I'm not an expert in critical raw materials, but one of the things that I focused a lot on in my research and even in, I would say, activism is knowledge and trying to work together with people in the local community, with, in my context, obviously Sami people, although sometimes I'm also in communities with indigenous, especially in North America. And that is trying to bridge the gap between an enormous Western discourse that is shaped primarily within Western ways of knowing that go back 1,000 years, up against indigenous people's knowledge that is developed on the ground in indigenous people's communities, on indigenous lands, in indigenous languages. And the gap between these knowledges is so great. So I'd like to just tell a few anecdotes where I've seen this come through. And maybe it's more of an appeal. There was a case in the Sami Parliament of Norway a few years ago. It was about a man named Josef Ante. I can't go into all the details. The point is that there was a court case, the Sami Parliament was intimately involved, and there was a Norwegian. And when I say a Norwegian, I mean an ethnic Norwegian from the dominant culture. Of course, I'm a Norwegian citizen, but I consider myself a Sami. This was a Norwegian man who was working for the Sami Parliament with the department that was supporting this reindeer herder in this case. And there was a seminar at the local museum in Tromsø at the time I was living there. And it was to go over the issues of this case and all the dynamics at play, which were very challenging. And here is this man who did not grow up in the Sami community, but had learned enough, who had taken the time to learn, and not only with his brain, but with his heart. And he stood before us, and I'll never forget this, and he cried, real tears, and he said, they just don't understand. They don't understand what is at stake for this man. And that is not the only time. In these local communities, and those of you who have been working with local people in indigenous communities, there's real pain. And this was a Norwegian who had taken the time to learn. So, I mean, if there's an appeal, and I don't even know where I am with the time, because I have other stories all about this. I've seen this over and over again in public context, and that is to, you know, if he can learn this and get to the point where he's crying because because the distance is so great and the stakes are so high, I think I'm just hoping that others will try as well to try to understand. And it's hard, right? Because if you don't speak the Sami language, I don't speak that much. We heard Stefan speak. Our languages are at stake. So there is a great deal for us as social scientists, as in indigenous studies, working with indigenous people, that we need to do to try to convey something that is so difficult to understand if you're coming from a very different knowledge system.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Yeah, it's incorporating the matter is also so crucial in order to mutually understand the other, so to speak, and or people, individuals within stakeholder groups. It's sometimes very, you have to step out of the comfort zone in order to understand the other, and sometimes it's not very comfortable, but it's so essential. Thank you, Ellen.
I'll just say one more thing, is that oftentimes indigenous people are required to understand the dominant system. They have to be experts in their own and the dominant. Mm-hmm. So what we're asking sometimes is, please try to understand our system as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ellen. And our last speaker now is Felix Kolb. And what strikes me, we had a little conversation the other day, and you said, wow, I mean, I'm doing research in the mining field, and there is so much obscure language around mining, and you as a social scientist, you told me that it's so essential for you to understand the broader picture, also technology and things like this. And I'm really eager to hear more about that and your experiences from your research. Please introduce yourself briefly, and we have some slides.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm Felix Kolb. I'm working at the University of Halle-Wittenberg, and in my PhD project I do research on more or less like the negotiation processes taken on the ground at the site of extraction in the peripheries of Europe, in particular the Spanish periphery in the Extremadura, a historically poor region in the far west of Spain. In Extremadura, I just brought a few pictures, so maybe next slide, is known for large ownership, orc forest, livestock farming, and really low population density, and notably for a huge lithium deposit underneath. So I was asked to describe briefly just the project. I will do this. So there are two significant lithium mining projects underway in Cáceres, or like in the region, in the whole region of Extremadura. And I will just focus on a mine which is really close to the UNESCO World Heritage City Center of Cáceres. So over there was an Australian mining company beginning in 2016 with drilling, prospecting. They really faced like legal challenges. There were some administrative errors, but on the other hand also like they drilled without permit, so all that unleashed a really strong local opposition. In the following, the company rebranded and returned in 2022 with a new sustainable underground mining project. Before it was an open pit mine, planned as an open pit mine. New money and a new CEO who really used the tailwind of this and aligning with the European Critical Raw Materials Act ambitions, and of course the skyrocketing lithium prices. And the regional government of Extremadura has supported this initiative from the beginning on, so they really pushed on local authorities because they had in mind like this greater image or imagination, resource imagination of becoming a green industrialized region, to change the model from an exploited, colonized European periphery. This is more or less the narrative which I just wanted to mention. So the current status is more or less we are still in the licensing process pending on an environmental impact assessment. So what are my key findings? Please, next slide. Over there's just a map where all this is located more or less. I just mentioned that the resource imagination of the government is more or less linked to a whole broader lithium ecosystem, which includes like processing plant, even though gigafactories of batteries and so on. So next slide please. So what are my key findings? The situation is totally polarized over there, with both sides accusing each other of misinformation and fraud, creating an atmosphere of totally mistrust. So there are like conflicting claims about job creation, how much, 1,500 direct jobs now, right now we're talking about 500, the numbers getting down, and of course environmental impact. And for me as a social scientist, it was always really hard to verify like the different statement from all stakeholder groups. And the local university, I just want to mention this, has not actively researched on this issue, so there's just a professor who's aligned to the industry and to the political elite, inviting them to the university for a speak, more or less, but this was taken place in a really exclusive way, and I think just the row or the cascade, the chain of these events, like of bilateral negotiations in a really exclusive surrounding, also fostered like frustration and non-communication and mistrust within the community. We had like this really knowledge asymmetries, and I just will mention just shortly one little detail. A lithium decree issued in 2022 October by the government of the Extremadura, with the aim to fast-track mining projects and linking future concessions of exploitation to the obligatory that the mineral is processed in at the same place, or at least on the ground of the Extremadura. And well, the Spanish central government challenged this because it is violating European competition law and even though like national law. But I just want to mention this to show that these kind of illegal populist practices are used to push forward own imaginations, own visions of future. And all this unleashed more or less and really civil expertise, which is really important on the one hand, but also must be also questioned in a way that I argue for, like that the disciplines talk to each other, that there's like this big lack of knowledge. We have like these knowledge asymmetries, and we have like the multiplicity of local concerns, and to link like both sides, I think it's really, really important to back up and acknowledge like these local concerns on the one hand, and to mediate as social scientists and as natural scientists, to mediate like planetary needs and matter of injustice, to just, I don't know, fostering transparent communication and involving the local communities in a way that they really have the chance to participate. Mm-hmm. So thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Felix. We have exactly 10 minutes left, and I have a lot of questions actually to the panelists, but we should immediately open the floor to everyone, and I would like to remind you that the overarching theme of this panel should be to understand a little bit what the role of research is in terms of societal impact and science and society communication. And excuse me. Please use the microphone so that the people on Zoom will understand you better.
Yes, I have a question for Ellen. I agree with you that in some part academics have difficulties to take into account the representations and aspiration, I don't know if we get desires, let's say, of local people. We have, for example, seen it in France with the Yellow Jacket movement. Yellow Jackets, Gilets jaunes. But we have also some field, for example, in geography, with cultural geography in France, for example, and anthropologists also, who try to figure out what are the representation of local people, their knowledge, their concepts of understanding the way society or the territory works. We call it in France savoir vernaculaire. And so I have a bit of difficulties to understand how you put into opposition two big categories of Western understanding, let's say, versus indigenous understanding. How do you define these categories?
Yeah. Thank you, because it does sound like I'm creating this ginormous binary, but it really comes through from things that I've seen on the ground. It's not to say that there isn't. Of course, it isn't as if the two knowledges don't interact, or that there isn't sharing, or but it's just it has more to do with the asymmetry of power relations when it comes to, especially in the Sami context, when you have, for example, a mining company who took the name of the mountain where the mining was to occur. They took the name of that in the Sami language and made it into the name of the company. So, conveying how painful and problematic that would be for a Sami reindeer herder who this is their, it's kind of a sacred place. You have to go very far, I think, to understand what that means. And I think there's one thing that we also haven't really talked about here, and that is, because it isn't just about knowledge in the sense of science, like in the sense of, it's also about a spiritual component, and I'm always remiss to, it's problematic sometimes to bring it up because it can be interpreted as somewhat new agey, or, that indigenous people are, spiritual, ancient ones on the land. But that is a component of it. So much of what we talk about is so often grounded in a very sort of secular idea of what knowledge is. Whereas for indigenous people, not as a monolith, but there is a spiritual element as well. And so, if we come into, for example, yoik, okay? Yoik is a very good example of how difficult it is to explain what is yoik. We don't even have the language so much outside of the Sami languages to explain, because yoik is not about something. It is not about. It is. It's so connected.
I don't also know what it is.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, yoik is the Sami way of it's not really a song, it's a social practice. Some people might say it's singing, but in the Sami tradition, people, animals, places, even in modern society, a snowmobile might have a yoik. So the idea is that the yoiker, or the person that composes the yoik, it really is the yoik comes. It's as if they're kind of there somewhere, and they come, and So you see, exactly. I can't explain this. I did a translation once with one word in the Sami language that has to do with this practice that is, to us, so critically important to who we are as a people, and I have to write almost a paragraph for one word. So that's the difficulty.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I have, there's a chat, a question in the chat. Yes?
There's quite an interesting one that came right at the beginning of the panel, and I can see that Bojana is still with us. So So it says you can all communicate together, but the European periphery, like Serbia and Bosnia, are not going to communicate with you. We don't want lithium mining on our fortunate soil. This is a pointless panel. Everyone take a break and have a coffee. Useless non-science. And I'm hoping that this person has changed their mind somewhat since the start of the panel. If you want to write something else, you can do. But does somebody want to respond at all to that? Because, you know, valid question about the peripheries. So cool.
It's so cool. Yeah, and the panel is about the social
What did it say again?
impact.
We can share it later. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you hear it acoustically? Does any?
Basically, people in the outer regions of Europe don't want to communicate with people in the.
Yeah. So I think we take it as a really valuable comment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that opens a new debate, of course, and I think this is the whole story about this imaginary of mining peripheries. We have the word mining frontier, resource frontier. This all indicates these disparities, the spatial disparities, and I have sorry, Michael,
Just
please.
very quick comment. The way this sounded to me, so was this person has made up her mind. I think it was a female, made up her mind. So mining is black, I'm white, full stop. And if that's the case, if we don't allow the conversation to happen because the mind is made up, then we can indeed go for a coffee.
Yeah, right.
Where is the same stand? I can't convince that person. That mind is made up, so we are here to discuss. And if the mind is made up, then we can't discuss.
But I have a question to you especially, and we run out of time, but we haven't yet talked here in the room this morning and not on the panels about the next generation. And I would be really curious, you as an educator in a mining university, so how about training, how about educating the young professionals? Are they also aware of this professional, academic, practical, skill-based dimension of what they do, and the society out there? Can they bring these two things together?
It's actually a very good point that I did not talk about before. There's two elements to that. The short answer to your question is yes, at least in Leoben. Everything I said about planetary boundaries, decent standards of living, the sufficiency debate, etc., is part of our curriculum. So the mining engineers leaving Leoben now, they are fully aware of that conversation and they are equipped to be part of that conversation. Because if they go out there to build the new mines, that's the issues they have to deal with. The technical issues, the technical aspects, etc. They are kind of a given now. They're solved pretty much. Whether or not it's economic, etc., to do method A versus method B, that's still a different story. That's what we're working on. But they need to be equipped for having exactly these type of conversations. One element. The second element to that is we are suffering, and that is part of what Holger said, that we have the resources in Europe, etc., but we might not have the people to explore and to exploit those resources. As technical universities, particularly, and I go to Australia as well, same thing, we're not seeing the students anymore. So whatever we want to do, we might not have the people actually in order to do that. It's different still in the developing countries, but in the developed countries, people don't want to become mining engineers anymore. Mm-hmm. So that might well be an issue as well, as we want to get towards the goals of the critical raw materials Act.
Is there?
Just to let you know, there's been a response.
There is a response. So just we are at the end of our time. But maybe could you read it out? This would be important.
No,
Sorry.
it's a whole discussion. So
It's a whole discussion. Can you summarize it? That's great.
Oh, cool.
That's
but
great.
I think the issue is that people locally may have said we don't want lithium mining in Serbia and Bosnia, but it's still going ahead. And people were saying, why is the discussion around how to have a better mine when we actually have already said we don't want it? And so I think this is a really interesting question, how you make the decision. You know, if somebody says no, does that mean we can assume they'll say yes later, or does it mean we want to accept that they've said no? And so I think this could be something to discuss.
May I ask you for the final statement before we leave for lunch break, Emma, because you are right in your work. You are working with community, you are working with companies. So what is your personal take on that, just as a kind of a, if there is ever a final statement, not at all, but
yeah. So
the final
apologies,
statement, yeah.
apologies to Bojana for summarising when I should have read every word. But it's quite difficult.
So maybe you
People
could,
have, well,
yeah.
Stephanie is also saying no
Yeah.
means no. The EU statement, okay. So, in a presentation about strategic project funding for the CRNA from a few weeks ago, the presenters said every member state will have the right to veto a proposed project on their territory. Will non-member states have the same rights, given that Serbia has vetoed the JVAP project, but meanwhile the company is in partnership with EU's Vector project and not going away?
Okay.
So
And then we have to
hopefully I've given enough voice to people online, because it has been difficult for us to have a proper conversation with the online people. Apologies for that.
Yeah,
Definitely raising
Yeah.
important questions.
Thank you so much, Emma, for the update from the chat. And of course, it's we have the limited time here, but I'm so excited that a lot of people have been online, and I would like to say thank you to the panel and thank you here in the room for comments. We have to close this session now, so and goodbye online participants. And I would say thank you.